Rightio. This is the demonstration for the tutorial for University of Tasmania. This is just me demonstrating what I'll be covering in the tutorial. Rightio, so we start with our Sketchup scene. This is the scene we'll be using for the tutorial to test out different lighting and how to actually export the mesh from Sketchup into Blender and then render it while in Blender. Right, so we've got quite a simple scene here. All our material stuff will be passed over into Blender when we export it. Now, to export this scene, we don't need to select the objects that are getting exported, as the entire scene will get exported. We simply go up into File, Export, 3D Model. Alright, now once we're in here, we choose the name of the export. So I'm going to go over into my tutorials folder here. I'm going to set up a new folder and I'm going to call this Export, just for the sake of illustration. And we're going to call this Test 1. Right, so we're going to be exporting this as a .dxf format. Now, if the SketchUp that is being used at the university has a .obj or .3ds export option, use this instead, because this can be imported directly into Blender. The steps that we're taking at the moment is we're going to have to export it as a .dxf, then import it as export as a .dxf, then re-export that to an FBX, and then re-export that to an OBJ, which can be natively imported. So we've got a few steps of importation that are actually going to have to happen before we can get this over to Blender. So let's get started on that. So let's go Test 1 here, AutoCAD DXF, and click on Export. Now once that's finished exporting, it will come up with a message, which you'll see soon. Oh yeah, there it is, AutoCAD Export Audit, OK, done. Right, so now once that's done, we're going to head over into our other program, and this is called FBX Converter. So we'll be able to convert the FBX into a format, which we can then convert into an OBJ. Right, so on our left in FBX Converter, we simply go Add, so we want to add the file, the FBX file. From there, we go to our directory that file is in under Export, test1.dxf. Right, so that's been pushed across. No need to change any of these settings. Now across here, the destination format is all set up as an FBX 2013 file format. So then we just click on Convert. What this is going to do is it's going to convert this file format into an FBX file format, and from there we'll be converting that to an OBJ file format. Right, so that's done. So I remove all, so I've cleared it, and then I click on Add again. Now I want to add the new file that I just exported out, so the FBX, and then I want to go to my destination format, and I want to turn that into a OBJ, which can be natively imported into Blender. Rightio, so I'll click on Convert. Right, so once we have exported the .obj using our converter program, we are then going to import it into Blender. So how to do this? First, let's delete the cube in the center of the scene. Now this is the default scene, have a cube in the center. Now you can do this just by pressing the delete key if it's already selected, or selecting the cube with the right mouse button, and then pressing delete on your keyboard and enter. Right, once we've done this, we're going to go up into the File tab in the top left, scroll down to Import, and we're going to be importing our wavefront.obj. So let's navigate first to the folder where we put the OBJ. For me, that's the tutorials export. Click on test1.obj, and then down in the bottom left, we want to change one setting. You don't need to change any of the others, but just the one setting for the forward rotation of the object. And we want to have that as Y forward. Naturally, it's -Z forward by default, but we want that as Y forward. So make sure to change that to Y forward, making sure that test 1 is selected, and then we click Import OBJ. As you can see, the file has been imported into our scene. First thing we need to touch on is simply navigating the scene. Now, I'll be going into more depth in the tutorial how to do this, and we'll be taking a slower approach, but just for the sake of Tim Law in actually checking this out, we're going to be going through it quite quickly. So the two different ways you can move around in your viewport come down to your numpad on your keyboard and your mouse. Now firstly, with the numpad, you have a few different axes you can snap to. The first is 1 on the numpad will snap to the y-axis, and that'll look at the front of the object. 3 on your numpad will snap to the side view, and then 7 on your numpad will snap to z-axis, which is an aerial top-on shot. So that way you can just quickly go around the different side, front and top of your scene. If you want to navigate the scene simply by, as if using a controller, use the 4, 2, 6 and 8 keys on your numpad. Now 4 and 6 are left and right, 8 and 2 are up and down. So as you can see, you can then just rotate around your scene using those 4, 2, 6 and 8 on your keyboard, and having to snap. If you have to snap to a certain rotation, you can do that as well. Now, one thing we want to do when we get into our scene is we want to select the axis for rotation. That way, when we're rotating around the scene, we're not rotating around some abstract point. We want to be rotating around the room. So if with your room selected, you can select all objects in the scene by pressing A on your keyboard, and that'll also deselect all the objects if you press it twice. So once will select all, A again will deselect all, and that can be a very handy tool if you want to deselect and select all objects in the scene. So if you press A, we're going to press delete on the numpad, not on the normal keyboard, on the numpad, and that'll snap us to the center of the scene. That way we'll be rotating around the room. Now I've actually got the camera in that one, so I don't want that. So how I'm going to deselect that is I'm going to hold down my shift key, and then I'm going to right click on my camera twice, and that'll deselect the camera from that selection. And I'm going to do that with my light over here as well. So I'm just going to hold down shift and right click twice on that, and then press delete on my numpad again, and that will just put my rotation around the room in the center of my scene. Rightio. So that's that. Now, grabbing, rotating and scaling objects is very easy in Blender. I'm not going to really touch on it much because we won't be needing it for this tutorial. But if you want to rotate an object, you simply click on it. Say for example the mattress on this bed. If I click on it and press R for rotate, I can then rotate this object. Now as you can see, the geometry axis point is down here. So a way to snap that to the object itself is just by holding Control Alt Shift C on your keyboard. So that's Control Alt Shift C, and then snapping your origin to geometry. So that'll set my origin to the geometry. And that way when I press R to rotate, I'll be rotating on that axis. And I can select my axes as well for rotation, scale and grab. So if I want to rotate, say on the X axis, all I have to do is go R for rotate and then X for X axis, and then it'll rotate only on the X axis. And the same with Z and Y. So very handy. And that's the same with grabbing and scaling. So to grab, you simply press G when you've selected an object, and that'll allow you to grab. You can snap that to different axes. And to scale is simply S on your keyboard. So you press S, and from there you can scale on, again, different axes as well. And that's just by pressing S and then defining your axis on your keyboard. So Z, X or Y. Rightio. So now that's not extremely important. Once we have got our navigation under control and a few of the base elements of manipulating in our viewport, we're then going to try to make this entire thing one object. Because we have a material we want to spread across the whole object, that's that clay render material, because we won't be going in depth about materials in this tutorial. What we want to do first is we want to create this as one object. As you can see, when you select on different objects in the scene, they are separate to one another, so I can move these separately. What I want to do is I want to make the whole scene one object. Now how I'm going to do that is first get into a view where I can see the entire scene, and then I'm going to select the whole thing and then join it as one mesh. So to select it, first you can either do this by two ways. You can either select everything by pressing A twice and then simply deselecting the camera, holding shift and right clicking twice, shift right clicking twice on the light, and that way I have my whole scene selected. Or I can, with nothing selected, I can press B on my keyboard, and that'll allow me to drag across the objects I want selected. So if I click with my left mouse button and drag across, then everything that I have dragged across will be selected. Right, so I'm just going to unselect that lamp with shift right click. From here, it's very simple. You just go Control J, J for join, and make sure you have this is actually quite tricky. This can sometimes mess things up. So just so everyone knows, I'll be covering this in the tutorial in a more intuitive way. But when you have everything selected, so I'll do that quickly, you want to make sure one part of the mesh is specifically selected, because at the moment there is no parent object selected. So what I want to do is hold down shift and simply select with my right mouse button on one of the objects in the scene. As you can see, it's gone a yellow color as opposed to this orange color. You want to make sure one of the objects inside the scene you've selected has that yellow outlining, and that's just by holding shift and right click. So it'll make sure the program knows, okay, so it's this object here can be used as the parent. So we're just going to go Control Join on our keyboard, and as you can see, everything's now gone yellow. The whole object is 1, and if I press G on my keyboard to grab, you can see when I grab it, or if I press R and rotate it, the whole object is 1, or if I scale it with S. Rightio, now with the whole object being 1, we can now apply our material that goes across the entire thing. Now to do this, first we're going to have to delete the materials that are already there. It's quite simple. All the different panels here on the right side can seem quite daunting at first, but once you get the basic idea of some of the different controls, it can actually be really easy to navigate. It's just getting your head around the basic concepts inside of it. So now the tab we're going to be using is the Materials tab. So with my mesh selected, I can, if it's unselected, I can just press right click on it. I'm going to go over into this tab here, the Materials tab. Now that's the one with the circle with the tiled black and red on that. And we're just going to click in there. Now you can see here we've got all our different material settings for diffuse, specular shading. At the moment we're not going to be tampering with any of that. What we want to do is we want to get rid of the textures that are already here. Now to do that, it's very simple. We simply subtract them over here. We remove them from the selected material slot. So click on the subtract button a few times over until there's nothing left. And now we have the option to add a new material. And we're going to do that. We're going to go new material, and we're going to leave it by default because it's a nice white diffuse material. Rightio, so once that is done, we have the object ready. It's been exported out, we've imported it in, we've made it one object, we've got the material we want to use. Now we're going to do some lighting setup. Now lighting is quite simple in Blender, and it's very dynamic, it's very scalable, and yeah, it's very easy to use and manipulate. So the way to do this, deselect the entire scene by pressing A as many times as need be. And then we want to add a light. Now to add anything in Blender, you press Shift A, Shift Add. And that'll give you a menu will pop up, and it'll give you options to adding meshes, curves, surfaces, metaballs, blah, 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 cameras, lights, fields. What we want to do is we want to actually add a lamp. Now if we go down to lamp, we then have the option to add a point, sun, spot, hemi, or area lamp. Now the one we're going to be using is the hemisphere lamp. Now the hemisphere lamp is good because it adds environmental lighting as well as a direct lighting source. The sun lamp is also very good, but it takes a little longer to get it looking exactly how you want. So for now, and for this illustration, we're going to be using the hemisphere lamp. So to do that again, to reiterate, we go Shift A, we scroll down to lamp, hover over hemi, and then click with your left mouse button. As you can see, if I scroll out, you have a hemisphere lamp added to your scene. Now to rotate this to the right position, we're going to have to be using that grab, rotate, and scale transformation buttons that we were using before. Or we can use, as an addition, we can use the arrows that are actually given to us on the object, as you can see here. So I can click with my left mouse button on the blue arrow or the red arrow or the green arrow and change it on the relative axis that way. For this example, I might use that. So let's just rotate around this. I'm going to click and bring it out here, and we're going to come in via this window here. We want the light to be coming through there. So I'm going to move this lamp source, hemisphere light source out here. Rightio. Now I'm going to press 1 to snap to my front viewport. I'm going to scroll out a bit, and I'm going to press R to rotate. Now this will rotate clockwise and anti-clockwise. So I'm going to rotate it up to here, so you can see that white line going across the building. I'm going to press 7 on my numpad, which will snap me to my aerial view, and now I can rotate again on the clockwise and anti-clockwise axis. So I'm going to press R again to rotate, and I'm going to bring it round so it's going into the building. Rightio. So now if I click on the building with my right mouse button and press delete on my numpad, which, as we've said before, snaps our rotation axis to that object, I'm going to zoom around. And as you can see, the light is coming through this window, this line here, and it's coming in next to the bed. Now we can change this in the render engine itself, but for now that'll work out as a good lighting system. Right, so now the next step is actually rendering this out in cycles. Now this is all quite daunting. You can see the steps, it seems complicated, but once you get the hang of it, again, it'll become something that's a little more natural, and it's a very versatile and robust system. To get into cycles render engine, we want to go up the top here, at the top of the viewport, and you've got this Blender Render tab drop down. What we want to do is we want to click on that, and we want to go down to Cycles Render. So we're defining which render engine we want. So if we click on Cycles Render, now you can see once you've done that, if you click on the main room, over here the materials panel has changed slightly. Now that's because we're using a separate render engine, which means the materials are set up in a separate way. Now it's quite easy. We're not going to be doing anything too complicated with this. So all we're going to be doing with this particular scene is adding a diffuse material over our entire object. Now we've got the entire object as one solid object, so it's going to be very simple to do. All we do is we click on the Use Nodes button once we're in our material slot panel up here. We click on Use Nodes, and then it snaps to diffuse BSDF node by default. So it is already a diffused material. What we want to do as well is just click on this roughness tab here and set that to 1. All you have to do is click on the numbers and press 1 on your keyboard and enter, and that'll just mean that the object doesn't have high reflection diffuse. It's slightly more gritty. Once we've done this, we have our material set up, and all it comes down to now is changing the camera view. Now, as you can see up here, we've got our camera, which we can then move around with these different axis transform tools, these arrows. But we don't want to do that. It's quite a complicated system, and it takes quite a time to do all the orientation for the rotation and make sure it's all correct and check to make sure it works. What we're going to do is we simply find a view we like in our scene, just using our navigation tools on our numpad or our mouse. So we just find a view that we like, and just for the record, the way that I'm actually doing that thing where I'm not rotating but instead I'm changing the pan of my shot, I'm just holding down shift while the middle mouse button is in. So middle mouse button in will rotate around a certain axis, but if I hold down shift and middle mouse button, it'll actually pan around it, or it will allow me to change the location of that center axis just by my navigation. Right, so once we've got a view that we like, so I like this view here, we then can snap the camera to that view. And the way we do that is we go Control, Alt, 0 insert on the numpad. As you can see, my camera snaps there. Now, just to let you know, if I'm out navigating my scene, so I can just use my numpad again to get out and navigate my scene. If I ever want to jump into my camera, I just press 0 insert on my numpad, and that'll jump me straight into my camera view from any navigation area. Right, so once we're in our camera view, we can then start doing the rendering. Now, the way I'm changing my camera where it is once in camera view, I can simply click on the camera borderline here, as you can see it, and then press G to grab, or rotate or scale, and I'm just going to press G, and then I'm going to go back on the X-axis a little bit, just so I capture a bit more of my scene. Right, so we've got our camera set up, the lighting set up. Now all we have to do is render it out. Now the rendering has various different settings. What we're going to do is we're going to just go with the default rendering for now, and we're going to change one or two minor things to make it run a little bit faster on the computers at university. If you have a graphics card, dedicated graphics card in your computer, it's going to run a lot faster because it is a GPU, mainly GPU accelerated, but we will be using CPU acceleration at the University of Tasmania. So if I go over into my render tab here, we then have all the render options. Now this is extremely scary for anyone new, but don't worry too much about it. It's not too scary once you've got your head around it. Naturally, it's going to go to CPU rendering, so that's fine. We don't need to change anything there. And for now, we're just going to actually get into the rendering itself. Now, this is our rendering options. This allows us to change how many bounces the light does around the scene, the approximation, whether or not we're doing it unbiased or biased. But for now, we're just going to get straight into the rendering. And the way we do that is in our viewport, if we go down, and off to the left, we've got this little white circle here. Now this allows us to change how we see the mesh. Now you can see we've got bounding box, we've got wireframe, which allows us to see the wireframe of the mesh, we've got texture, which allows us to see like different materials on the objects, and then we've got material and rendered. Now if you click on rendered, you can then see it starts rendering it out. Now for the sake of this online tutorial, I'm going to be using GPU as my rendering option. That way it'll render a lot faster. Now you can see here it looks nice. You can see that there is a light source, but at the moment there is not that global illumination that you're going to get in real life. Everything's a bit too dark, it's a bit too washed out. So how do we change that? Quite simple. If we go back to solid view down here where we chose where rendered was, we go out into our navigation and we click on our light source. Let's click on the light source there. And over here on the materials option panel, you can see that you've got this light option. So you've got this yellow thing with an arrow coming out of it, and this allows us to change the properties for our light source. Now to do that, I want to click Use Nodes, like I do with everything, and then you can see here it's an emission node. And I just want to turn the strength up a bit, so I'm going to turn this strength up to about 8. So now if I snap back into my camera, with 0 insert on my numpad, and I go down into the rendering option, you can see there that I've increased the light coming from the sun, or the hemisphere light source, and it creates a far more realistic, that very solid light hitting on the bed there. Now another way to select the light source without actually having to get out of the render engine is simply up here in the top right. Now up in the top right we've got all the different objects and property and null objects and stuff like that we have in the scene. So we can easily select objects up here without having to get out of the render engine, and we can see it affect what's happening in this viewport while we're changing properties. So I'm going to go to lamp here, and you can see it's got this little hemisphere text right next to it, and the hemisphere icon. So I can click on that, and it shows that I've got that selected. So I can now change the properties of the light from my viewport. So I can go for something that's really hard light, or maybe something slightly harder than what we were with before, so 10. And I can change the color of my light source as well from here. So if I wanted a pink or blue, or if it was a night time or anything like that, but we're going to go with white for now. So that's changing the light source. Now I can also change different objects in my scene. So if I'm in my render engine and I right click on an object and press G, I can then move it around, and then click again and it'll be there. I can rotate the scene around. And if you've got separate objects, at the moment we've got one big object, but if you've got separate objects, you can scale them, rotate them, grab them, move them, all while rendering, so you can see the effect it's having on your scene. Now one setting we want to change to make sure we've got a bit more like ambient lighting happening inside of this scene, like it does in real life, a bit more light bouncing around. We want to go over to the, up in this tab section, we want to hover over the world option. Now that's the blue earthy kind of planet icon. So we hover and click on that, and we want to go to surface, and we want to click use nodes. Rightio, so it's got background selected. Now all I want to do is I want to change the color to white. Now the lighter the color is, the more it's actually emitting. As you can see, I'm going to go to a kind of a grayish color like that. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here. Rightio, and you can see that's adding a whole lot more light to the scene. You can see with what we're rendering at the moment, it's very pixelated. I probably should have pointed this out a little bit earlier, and I'll try to do that in my tutorial. You can see that it's extremely pixelated. Now the way an unbiased render engine works is that it becomes less and less pixelated over time. So the longer it renders, the less pixelated it becomes. This allows us to manipulate things in the scene and not have to go back, do it all, press a button, wait until it's rendered 6 hours, and then find there's something wrong, and then have to do it all over again. With this GPU method, we can change it all on the fly, and it's a lot more interactive, and it becomes a lot better workflow. Right, so we've done some simple lighting, we've done an extremely simple material on the entire object, and yeah, so now one thing you might want to try is actually rotating and moving your light source in the render engine. So again, I'm just going to go to the top right, so we can select an object while I'm rendering. So I'm going to select the hemisphere, and I'm going to press G. Now I'm going to simply move my mouse across on the scene, and you'll see the actual change of where the lighting's hitting, as you can see here. So the light is hitting. So one way I can do this as well is just by pressing R and then rotating on the Z axis. So that light is rotating as if I was in aerial view, and it was rotating 360 degrees. So what I'm going to do is press R and then Z with my hemisphere selected, and then I'm just going to move my mouse and then let go and click, and you can see I've moved my lighting. Now this is extremely powerful because you can take time to actually find the most ideal lighting setup, and you can take time to actually see what will it look like at this certain time of day, like with the light hitting across my bed. Is enough getting captured on the floor or certain objects in the scene? But yeah, an extremely powerful thing to be able to rotate and move elements while inside the render engine. Right, so that pretty much clears that up. If we want to speed up our render, so we've done pretty much everything. So you now know how to add materials, you know how to add a lighting hemisphere source, and you know how you can rotate that while you're rendering. Now what we want to touch on is a few render engine optimizations. Now this becomes a little bit scary for a lot of people, but I'm going to give you a few helpful hints just to speed up your render time, especially on the university computers. This will be applied. So I'm going to go over into my camera or render property folder up here in the top right. And I want to scroll down a little bit, down to where it says light paths. Now you can see here at the moment we've got limited global illumination as our set preset. Now that means we're not getting light bouncing in from all directions. We're limiting the amount of global illumination and ambient lighting that is happening inside the scene. If we had global illumination with sampling turned right up, we would be sampling hundreds upon hundreds of light bounces, and it would take a very long time for it to become less grainy, and it would take a very long time to compute. So to kind of approximate this, I'll do a bit of a shortcut and get almost the same result, but at a far quicker time. We're going to use limited global illumination. Now if you want to go even faster again, you can use direct light as the preset. Now to refresh my render engine, I'm just going to press tab on my keyboard. But as you can see, the lighting is far, far too direct. The light comes in at one angle, and it doesn't bounce around hardly at all. So this method, yeah, it can be used for very fast illustration perhaps of lighting, but you're not going to get a very realistic result. I recommend for now using limited global illumination. I'm just going to press tab again to refresh that. And that'll have light bouncing around the room, far more realistic, and it'll make materials look a heap better. And if you wanna customize, if you wanna manually change some of these settings, over here on bounces, the less bounces you have, the less time it's going to take to compute, but obviously the less light bounces around the room, the less good it's going to look. So I can change all those different materials and those different settings. Rightio, so that's pretty much the basics of it. When it comes to materials and stuff, it can be extremely simple to change to, like I say, a glossy material. Instead of diffuse here, I just go glossy. I can then turn up the roughness and get all these cool shaders and all this kind of stuff, like a more metallic kind of thing going on here. But yeah, so this is just the general idea of how to set up a scene, import it in, and do some basic clay rendering. When it comes to light emission in terms of things such as emission from an object itself, as opposed to simple one light source or spotlight, again, it's very simple. So if I snap outside my view and I make sure I've got solid selected down here, I can simply do the Shift A, so Shift Add again, and I can add a sunlight, a point light, an area light. All these lights have different functions. Point lights are simply like this up here is a point light. This will simply, I'll drag that down and put it in the middle of my scene, go into my camera and render. This is an ovular shape that is emitting light at a full 360 on all axes. So it's just blasting light out of an oval kind of shape that you can't see. And as you can see here, I can change the different color for that light. And I can press G and grab it and rotate it and move it around my object. As you can see, you've got different lighting setups you've got here. But you can see that light, when it moves close to objects, will become far more intense in its lighting. So that's that. That's just setting up like a light bulb kind of lighting. Or we can set up an actual emission object. Now the way we do this is we go Shift A, and I'm going to add a mesh, and I'm going to add a plane. So I'm just going to add a plane mesh. Here it is here. Rightio. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to get this object to emit light. So I just go Add New Material over here in the Materials. You go Surface Material. I want it to be Emission. And now this object will emit light. Now, one important thing in this is to know what side of this object the light will be emitted from. Now the way you can do this, you can either jump into your render engine and rotate the object around and see which way the light's actually coming out. Oh, let's set that to 2 strength. So I can see the lights coming down from this way. But instead of having to do that, I'm just going to press Ctrl Z a few times here. I can check out which way the direction's coming from. That's by pressing N on my keyboard. I'm going to pull up this side panel, or I can just click on the plus here. I'm going to scroll down to Display and press Tab on my object, so I go into Edit mode, and then I can just display the normals here by clicking on this little box with a face. So I want to see what face is producing light. So click on that, and you can see this blue line coming out of it here in the center is showing that it's coming from this side of the object. The normals are being projected. Again, it's probably easier just for the students just to see, to test it out themselves and actually see that. as opposed to having to go through that complicated method of getting there. Rightio, so once we've done that, we can select the object, and like everything else, we can just move it across using these, or rotate it with R button, or G to move it around. I'm just going to set it up. I'm going to go to my side view with 3 on my numpad, and press rotate with R, and I'm going to rotate it like so. I'm going to G, click, and move it up there. And you can see I'm just going to project light onto that bed. And then I'm going to go to my render engine here, so click on rendered. And now, as you can see, it hasn't moved, so I'm going to press tab, and that'll refresh it. Alright, now it's pushing light towards the bed. Now, if I turn the strength up to like 3 and a blue light, you can see where the light is actually coming from here. Now, I'm going to turn my sun lamp off, my hemisphere lamp, just to show you guys what that would look like a nighttime kind of thing. So click on Hemi in the top right, and then turn the strength down to 0. As you can see here, we're projecting light on to the bed. Now another way I can Shift D will duplicate the object. I can press Shift D and then move with my mouse, and then possibly rotate it on the Z axis and set up another light over here. You know, change the coloring of that light. But yeah, so emission objects are really good. Say for example, if you've got a spotlight or a drop-down lamp on one of the walls. And yeah, really powerful tool, especially at night times for the interior lighting of a building. And I could turn my hemisphere light back on, so to 2. And then you've got combined lighting, so you've got the sunlight plus the hemisphere lights. Now, in photography a lot, they'll have like a diffuse light behind the camera, and you can set that up as well. So if I just go into my viewport, and go to solid again so I can see everything, I might grab this emitter here, go into aerial view with 7 on my numpad, G to drag it behind my camera. I'll just check to make sure that's right, yep. And then I can go back into my rendering, 0 insert on my numpad, rendered. And then by changing, it's called plane 0 by the way, the one that's behind my head. By changing the actual strength of the object itself, I can change that light from behind where I actually am. So yeah, so you can set it up that way to have all these different emission lights, sun lamps, and also spotlights just around the building. And there are a few different methods. Obviously, this is more for displaying to the lecturers who are going to be overseeing my tutoring. And you can get a general idea of some of the basic concepts that we'll be going through, and you can also understand how these concepts work. And yeah, so when Wednesday comes, I'll try to have a far more fluid way of actually running through this. But you'll get the general concept, and if there's any critiques, just send them my way. Anything I've missed,